The air on this frozen rock didn't just bite, it excavated. Every breath Jake Morrison dragged into his lungs felt like inhaling a handful of diamond dust, shredding the soft tissue of his throat and leaving a metallic tang of impending failure in his mouth. He slogged through a shifting, white hell, his HUD flickering with a series of red-etched warnings that told him what he already knew. The thermal suit was bricking. The power pack was bleeding out, its internal hum transitioning into a high-pitched whine, the sound of a machine giving up the ghost. Behind him, the wreckage of his ship was a jagged silhouette of scorched carbon and twisted titanium, a half-buried grave illuminated only by the frantic, dying strobe of a distress beacon. It was a beacon for nobody, the vacuum didn't care, and neither did the corp that had signed off on his flight path. Then, through the crystalline blur of his frosting visor, he caught it, a low, dirty orange flicker. Not the sterile glow of a LED, but the primitive, chemical combustion of a fire. It was a sign of life, or at least a sign of something that intended to stay warm while everything else turned to brittle glass. He forced his deadened legs toward the heat, his heart knocking against his ribs like a desperate inmate in a maximum security block. The shelter was a low-slung, ugly piece of architectural scavenging, crimped alloys and slabs of local basalt fused together with the kind of desperation you only find at the edge of the galaxy. Jake hammered on the hullplate door with a fist that had lost all haptic feedback, the impact echoing like a gunshot in the frozen air. No one came. He swore, the sound a ragged rasp in his suit's comms, and attacked the manual override. The mechanism was choked with ice, screaming in protest as he forced it, until finally, the seals shattered with a sound like bone snapping. He fell through the gap into a humid, pressurized pocket of air that smelled of ozone and unwashed skin. Across the cramped space, a figure stood silhouetted against a fire pit, radiating a lethal, predatory stillness. She was tall, her frame a lean architecture of violet muscle and dark, insulated tactical wear. Two horns, curved and sharp as combat knives, jutted from a forehead that didn't belong to any deck plan he'd ever seen. Her eyes were twin apertures of burning sulfur, tracking him with the cold efficiency of a targeting computer. She looked like something out of a wetwork nightmare, an exotic anomaly in a galaxy that had supposedly been mapped to death. "What the hell are you doing here, human?" The voice was a serrated edge, stripped of empathy. Jake held his hands up, the universal gesture for "I'm unarmed and currently dying." His knees were doing a nervous jitter that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with systematic hypothermia. "Ship went down," he croaked, the words feeling like jagged shrapnel in his throat. "Total loss. I'm looking for a warm corner and a reason not to flatline." The alien, Vex'ra, though he didn't know it yet, narrowed those sulphurous eyes, her hand hovering near a heavy-looking piece of tech on her hip. "Mercy is a luxury I stopped carrying 3 systems ago," she spat, the slang of the outer rim bleeding through her accent. Jake looked at the open door, then back at her. "I'll be a ghost. I just need enough heat to stop my blood from turning into slush." She surveyed him with the detached disgust of a tech looking at a corrupted data drive. The fire spat sparks against the corrugated walls, throwing long, distorted shadows that looked like the ghosts of everyone he'd ever failed. Finally, she jerked a thumb toward the shadows. "Crouch in the corner. Don't touch the gear. Don't even breathe loud." Jake slumped into the dark, peeling back his gloves to reveal hands the color of a bruised corpse, the sudden influx of heat hitting his nervous system like a high-voltage jolt. The woman turned her back, a move that spoke of either immense confidence or a complete lack of concern for his existence. Jake huddled in the gloom, his eyes adjusting to the low-light environment. The shelter was a masterclass in survivalist engineering, crates of black-market tech stacked like armor plates, scavenged atmospheric scrubbers humming a low-frequency baseline, and racks of specialized gear that suggested she wasn't just hiding, she was staged. In the center, the fire pit roared, a primitive heart in a high-tech cage. To the left, a sleeping dais was draped in heavy, dark furs that looked like they'd been harvested from something that didn't go down without a fight. "You've been in this hole a while," Jake noted, his voice a low vibration. She didn't look back. "Obviously." When he pressed for a Y, she went rigid, her silhouette a sharp, jagged line against the orange glow. "My past is encrypted, human. Don't try to hack it." The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Eventually, she threw a question his way like a bone to a stray. "Name?" He whispered it into the dark. "Jake." She let the word hang there for a second, then dismissed it. "Vex'ra." He tried a thank you, but she cut him off with a snort that sounded like an engine stalling. "Save the gratitude for someone who gives a damn. You're only here because I don't feel like hauling a frozen carcass out of the airlock tomorrow." Jake sat near the flame, a broken man-machine hybrid waiting for his internal systems to reboot. The atmosphere between him and Vex'ra was thick enough to choke a filter, a high-tension wire of mutual suspicion. She sat across from him, her posture a clinical study in combat readiness, those yellow eyes never drifting far from his throat. He was a breach in her security, a variable she couldn't account for yet. Every time he shifted, her muscles coiled with the lethal potential of a triggered claymore. "I should have left you to the drift," she muttered, the bitterness in her voice refined to a razor point. Jake stared into the coals. "But you didn't. Maybe your hard-coding isn't as clean as you think." She leaned into the light, her horns casting long, demonic silhouettes on the basalt walls. "Don't get it twisted, Morrison. I don't like humans. Your kind has a habit of colonizing everything they touch, including other people's problems." Jake gave her a tired, cynical grin. "I'm not here to plant a flag. I'm just waiting for the sky to stop screaming so I can find a way off this ice cube." Vex'ra let out a dry, hacking laugh. "The sky doesn't stop here. The storms on this planet aren't weather, they're a planetary defense system. They can last for weeks. You're not just a guest, you're a long-term liability." A cold, heavy weight dropped into Jake's stomach, the realization that his stay was likely going to be measured in lifespans rather than hours. This wasn't a layover, it was a life sentence. Vex'ra watched the mask of his composure slip with a predatory smirk. "The wind out there is tuned to the frequency of your death," she said, her voice dropping into a low, mocking hum. "And there isn't a shuttle in the sector that can punch through that atmospheric soup." Jake wiped a hand across his face, feeling the grime and the salt. "Then I guess I'm moving in." Vex'ra's expression went flat, bored. "Stay in your lane, then. And don't clutter my workspace." He watched the way she moved, the economy of motion, the way she checked her gear with a practiced, military rhythm. She wasn't some backwater colonist. "How many years?" he asked. "In this tomb?" She poked the fire with a length of rebar, sparks exploding like micronovas. "Long enough to stop counting the rotations," she whispered, and for a split second, the cynical armor cracked to reveal a void of absolute, crushing isolation. He asked about the shelter's origin, and she told him she'd reclaimed it, the previous occupant having been deleted by the environment long ago. Jake scanned the interior again, noting the scars in the metal and the improvised repairs. This place had been a theater of survival for a long time. But Vex'ra was the most dangerous component in the room. Her hatred for his species was a hardwired bias, thick and impenetrable. "Is it just the DNA?" he asked. "Or did a human do you dirty?" Vex'ra's eyes snapped to his, the yellow glow flaring. "It's the entitlement, Morrison. You fall from the sky and expect a welcome mat. You think the universe owes you a second chance because you were stupid enough to crash." The brutality of the truth hit him like a kinetic slug. He rubbed his temples, where a headache was beginning to pulse. "I'm not looking for a friend," he countered. "I'm looking to survive the night." She leaned back, her slender violet arms crossing over her chest. "I have the fire. I have the walls. I don't need a partner." Jake snorted, the sound echoing in the small space. "And what happens when the things prowling in the blizzard decide to breach the hull?" She hesitated, a microscopic hitch in her breath. "Nothing gets in," she said, but the conviction was a facade, a thin layer of chrome over rusted iron. Jake didn't let it slide. "You don't believe that? I saw the marks on the door." Her jaw tightened into a hard line. "Stay in your corner, Morrison. Don't touch the tech. Don't touch the fire. And for God's sake, don't touch the silence. I'll decide if you're a functional asset or just more dead weight to be jettisoned," Vex'ra said, her voice regaining that icy, high-born arrogance. Jake let out a dry, rattling chuckle. My life as a line item on your balance sheet. Typical. She didn't respond, sinking back into a state of statuesque, violet repose. The fire was the only thing in the room that seemed to have a pulse, consuming the oxygen with a hungry, rhythmic crackle. Outside, the world was a cacophony of white noise, a perpetual hammer blow against the shelter's hide. Jake knew the math. He was a man without a stack, without a backup, held in the begrudging custody of a woman who viewed him as a system error. But he'd survived the void and the crash, and he wasn't going to let a cynical exile intimidate him into a premature shutdown. He watched her through the haze of the firelight, wondering what kind of betrayal had dumped a creature like her on this frozen hellworld. Vex'ra finally broke the quiet, her voice a low murmur. "Don't do anything stupid, Jake." He smirked, even though his lips were cracked and bleeding. "I'm a human. Stupid is our primary export." She shot him a look of pure, concentrated venom, but the conversation was over. The long dark had truly settled in. The wind outside had escalated into a full-blown atmospheric assault, a screaming choir of ghosts trying to tear the shelter's skin off. The metal groaned, a deep, resonant lament that echoed in Jake's bones, and the cold began to bleed through the seals like a digital virus. He pulled his arms tight against his chest, his internal temperature regulation a failing circuit. The thermal suit was a cold, rubbery coffin now. Across the pit, Vex'ra was a statue of violet steel, unbothered, poking at the coals with the detachment of a bored god. She existed in a different thermal bracket entirely. Jake watched her, his teeth clicking together in a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. His muscles were seized up, and every breath felt like a jagged piece of code tearing through his lungs. Vex'ra looked up, her sulphurous eyes scanning him with a technician's precision. "You're shivering, Morrison. It's inefficient." He managed a ragged grimace. "An old human hardware glitch. We call it dying." She rolled her eyes, a gesture of profound irritation. "How inconvenient." He glared at her. "Sorry, my biological specs aren't up to your standard." She stood up, her tall, lithe frame casting a shadow that reached across the ceiling like a predatory hand. "I won't have a blue, stiffened corpse cluttering my floor. It messes with the workflow." Vex'ra's irritation was a physical heat. "You're a frail piece of organic refuse," she snapped, her voice cutting through the roar of the blizzard. "I can hear your heart. It's a stuttering engine, ready to stall. You'll be a statue of frozen meat before the first watch is over if you stay in that corner." Jake tried to push himself up, but his legs were offline, failing him like rotted pillars. He started a protest, but she moved with a speed that bypassed his reaction time. Vex'ra strode across the chamber and seized him by the collar of his suit, hauling him up with the effortless strength of a hydraulic press. "What? Stop," he gasped, but she ignored him, dragging him across the floor as if he were a bag of salvaged scrap. She kicked back the heavy, rank furs of the sleeping dais, revealing a nest of dark pelts and improvised blankets. With a forceful shove, she sent him tumbling into the bedding. Before he could recalibrate, she climbed in beside him, her long, violet limbs entangling with his. Jake froze, not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming proximity of her. She was a furnace. Heat radiated from her skin in thick, sweet waves, a heavy-duty thermal output that felt like being submerged in a warm oil bath. "Shut up, human," she hissed, her yellow eyes inches from his. "We're locked in this cage together. You'll stay here and stay warm, or I'll kill you myself just to save on the oxygen." Jake lay there, his mind a chaotic data dump of shock and sensory input. He was pressed against a creature of violet muscle and hidden steel, wrapped in furs that smelled of musk, ozone, and old gun oil. The heat from her body was an aggressive, active force, soaking into his marrow and overwriting the ice in his blood. It was a biological overclock, a furnace in the shape of a woman. "Why?" he managed to ask, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird. Vex'ra scowled, her horns almost brushing the furs above them. "It's hygiene, Morrison. I refuse to live in a tomb with your rotting remains. You're a nuisance, and this is the most efficient way to keep your annoying life signs active." Jake shifted awkwardly, his numb fingers beginning to scream with the agonizing pins and needles of returning circulation. Efficiency. Right. I'm just a maintenance task. She pulled the furs tighter, sealing them into a cocoon of unnatural heat. Her body was a heavy, solid weight against his, and despite the insanity of the situation, Jake felt the shivers finally begin to fade. "My thanks," he whispered. Vex'ra clicked her tongue, a sound of dry, high-frequency annoyance. "Just don't make it a conversation, Morrison. Sleep, or I'll reconsider the hospitality." The storm continued its frantic demolition of the world outside, but inside the furs, the universe had compressed to the space between their heartbeats. Jake, warmed by the strange, biological fire of the woman beside him, felt the exhaustion finally override his system. The crash, the cold, the cynicism, it all drifted into the background, replaced by the rhythmic rise and fall of Vex'ra's chest. He woke later, the shelter still dim, the air thick and heavy. He was a map of bruises and aches, but the lethal chill had been purged. Vex'ra was awake, her yellow eyes fixed on the ceiling, her expression a mask of stony, violet indifference. Jake cleared his throat, the sound loud in the small space. "Is this normal? For your kind?" She turned her head, her sulphurous gaze flat and unblinking. "The thermal output? It's an evolutionary adaptation. My world was a place of black winters and sudden, violent thaws. We are our own climate control." She shifted, her violet skin brushing against his. "And right now, I'm being an exceptionally generous power source." Jake offered a small, jagged smirk. "So you do have a heart. It's just buried under a lot of cynical code." She shot back a look of pure frost. "I care about the air quality. Dead humans smell like failure. It's that simple." He chuckled, a dry rattle. "A poet, truly." Her eyes narrowed. "Sleep, Morrison. Or I'll put you on the floor." But sleep was a ghost. A sound, deep, resonant, and utterly wrong, vibrated through the stone floor. It was a boom, a thunderous impact that made the salvaged metal of the shelter scream in protest. Jake bolted upright, his HUD-less eyes wide. "What was that?" Vex'ra's hand, cold and clawed, clamped over his mouth before he could finish. "Be still," she breathed, her voice a ghost of a whisper. Her expression was no longer bored, it was a map of focused, primal tactical analysis. They lay there, two shadows in a nest of fur, as the sound returned. Heavy, rhythmic thuds, the footsteps of something gargantuan and deliberate, crunched through the snow outside. Then came a growl, a low-frequency rumble that Jake felt in his molars, a sound of ancient, cold hunger. It was the planet's apex predator, prowling around their iron cage. "What is it?" Jake whispered into her palm. She leaned into his ear, her breath a hot puff of air. "A variable the fire can't solve." Another thud struck the wall, and the entire structure groaned, the metal buckling inward as if under the weight of a falling crane. Jake started to move, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Vex'ra's grip on his arm was like a vice of cold alloy. "Movement is a beacon," she hissed. "They track the rhythm of a heartbeat. And they track the heat." Jake looked at her, his pulse a frantic drum solo. "But we're a bonfire in this bed." She cursed in a language that sounded like grinding glass. "I know." Outside, the creature began to scrape against the metal, its massive claws sounding like a diamond saw through a hull plate. The screech was agonizing, a needle across the nerves. Jake held his breath, the furs suddenly feeling like a shroud. Then, with a final, frustrated snarl that shook the rafters, the presence began to withdraw. The heavy, rhythmic crunches faded into the white noise of the gale. Silence, thick and suffocating, returned to the shelter. Jake let out a long, shuddering breath. "What was that?" Vex'ra released him, her face a pale violet mask in the gloom. "A reminder that we aren't the top of the food chain here," she said, her voice trembling with a rare, honest fear. "The ice isn't the only thing that deletes life on this rock. To them, you're just a packet of protein in a cold world." "You knew they were out there," Jake said, his voice flat with accusation. Vex'ra sat up, the furs falling from her violet shoulders. "Of course. I've shared this rock with them for cycles. They're the true admins of this wasteland." Jake rubbed his eyes, the gravity of his situation sinking in like a heavy G landing. He was trapped in a box with a violet predator, while larger, hungrier things circled outside in a storm that might never end. Survival, he muttered. A full-time job with no benefits. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, the sound of those claws echoing in his head. We're both dead men walking, aren't we? Vex'ra looked at him, her yellow eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. Maybe. But I intend to walk as long as possible. The night stretched on, a grey and endless void, and Jake Morrison realized that the crash was just the preamble to a much longer, much darker descent into the heart of the ice. Jake remained awake, a captive of the flickering shadows and the rhythmic groan of the metal walls. Beside him, Vex'ra was a statue of violet marble, her eyes open and fixed on the dying fire. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer the friction of two strangers, but the shared gravity of two survivors. Is this it, then? Jake asked, his voice a low vibration. You just exist here? In this iron jar? Vex'ra didn't turn her head. I endure. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across concrete. Jake shifted his weight. Why? Why stay in the throat of the blizzard? She turned her head then, her sulphurous eyes locking onto his. Why do you care, Morrison? Is your own mortality not enough of a puzzle? Jake shrugged. I'm curious about my cellmate. It passed the time until the systems fail. Vex'ra let out a slow, deliberate breath. I was deleted from the social register, she said, the words heavy with a bitterness that felt ancient. Exiled. My people decided that my presence was a corrupted file. Jake frowned. Exile. That's a heavy-duty sentence. What did you do? Leak the wrong intel? Steal the company jet? Vex'ra gave a small, humorless smirk. I was a threat, Jake. I was stronger than their protocols, and smarter than their CEOs. They fear what they cannot control, so they gave me this rock as a private server. Jake studied her, the way the firelight played across the curves of her horns. A familiar story. Power is a dangerous zero-day exploit. She nodded slowly. They left me here to go offline, a slow extinction in the white dark. But I'm still running. Jake looked at her with a newfound respect. And you've been here for how long? She gestured vaguely at the storm. Time doesn't have a clock here. It just piles up like the snow. Jake sighed, rubbing his aching temples. Well, if I find a way off this rock, you're coming with me. I don't give a damn about your people's laws. Vex'ra blinked, her yellow eyes widening in genuine shock. You would take an exile? A threat? Jake grinned, though it was a tired, ragged thing. I'd take a combat-ready dragon if it meant getting out of here. Besides, I've always had a thing for high-risk variables. Vex'ra looked away, a ghost of a smile tugging at her violet lips. You really are a glitched human, Morrison. Sleep eventually claimed him, a heavy and dreamless void. When he woke, the world was still grey, the wind still a screaming banshee, but the nest beside him was empty. The sudden absence of Vex'ra's heat was a physical blow, the cold rushing back into the furs like a system-wide crash. He sat up, his heart quickening. Vex'ra? Silence. Only the wind answered. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and wrapped a heavy pelt around his shoulders. The door of the shelter was ajar, a sliver of blinding white light cutting through the gloom. Jake swore and stumbled toward the exit. Outside, the blizzard was a wall of needles, the world a chaotic swirl of gray and white noise. Through the haze, he saw her, a violet silhouette standing motionless against the fury of the storm. She was looking out into the blankness, her posture tense, her claws flexed. Vex'ra, he shouted, the wind tearing the name from his lips. What are you doing? You'll freeze. She didn't turn. They are back, she said, her voice a low vibration that carried through the howling air. Jake moved to her side, the cold biting into his skin like a data scrubber. He looked out into the white void. At first, he saw nothing. Then, shapes began to resolve, massive, hulking shadows prowling just beyond the veil of the storm. There were 3 of them, their movements slow and rhythmic, circling the shelter like sharks around a lifeboat. Their eyes were smoldering coals in the grey light. "They are testing the perimeter," Vex'ra murmured. "Waiting for a drop in the firewall." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "What's the play?" Vex'ra turned to him, her eyes burning with a primal, predatory light. "We don't wait." Before he could argue, she stepped forward into the heart of the storm. "Get inside, Morrison. This isn't your fight." Jake let out a disbelieving laugh. "I'm not going back in that box while you're out here playing hero." Vex'ra shot him a look of pure, concentrated fury. "You're a liability. You have no claws, no strength, no heat." Jake stood his ground, the wind whipping his hair into a frenzy. "I have eyes, don't I? I can watch your six." Vex'ra hissed, a sound of pure irritation, but she didn't push him away. She turned back to the circling shadows, her body coiling like a spring of violet steel. "Then watch," she said. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind reaching a pitch of hysterical screaming. Suddenly, the shadows lunged. One of the creatures burst through the white veil, a nightmare of fur and jagged, crystalline plates. It was a mountain of muscle and malice, its gaping maw filled with rows of black, serrated teeth. It charged with a terrifying, rhythmic speed. Vex'ra moved before Jake could even process the data. She was a blur of violet motion, meeting the beast head-on. The impact was a dull thud that Jake felt in his marrow. Vex'ra didn't recoil. She twisted mid-air, her claws raking across the creature's face with a sound like metal on stone. Black, steaming blood sprayed into the snow. The beast roared, a sound that shook the very ground, and staggered back, dazed. But it wasn't alone. A second creature lunged from the side, its massive claws reaching for Jake. He threw himself into the snow, the icy needles biting into his face as he scrambled away. The creature's jaws snapped shut inches from his boots. He scrambled to his feet, his heart a frantic bird in his chest, and saw Vex'ra already turning. She leaped over the first beast, her movements possessing a fluid, impossible grace, and struck the second one with a kick that sent it skidding across the ice. "Morrison! The door!" she screamed. But Jake didn't move toward the shelter. He grabbed a piece of jagged metal from the refuse pile, a broken rib from his ship, and stood his ground. He was a man of the stars, a survivor of the void, and he wouldn't die cowering in a corner like a corrupted file. The third creature, the largest of the pack, roared from the white dark. It was a titan of frost, its eyes burning with an ancient, cold intelligence. It ignored Jake, its gaze fixed solely on Vex'ra. It charged, its massive bulk plowing through the snow like an avalanche. Vex'ra didn't dodge, she grinned, a flash of sharp, ivory teeth. She waited until the beast was upon her, then leaped high into the air, twisting like a dancer. She landed on its back, her claws digging deep into its thick, armored hide. The beast thrashed, a mountain of fury trying to shake her off, but she held on, her expression one of focused, primal joy. She raised her hand and plunged her claws into the base of the creature's skull. A final, gurgling roar escaped the beast, and it collapsed into the snow, motionless. Silence returned, save for the howling wind. Vex'ra stood atop the fallen titan, her chest heaving, her violet skin stained with black blood. She looked like a goddess of the wastes, a primal force of nature. She turned to Jake, her yellow eyes glowing with the remnants of the fight. "You're still online," she said, her voice a low murmur. Jake looked at the broken piece of metal in his hand, then at the carnage around them. "So are you." She hopped off the creature's back, her movements once again fluid and graceful. "That should buy us some time. But the ice never forgets." She strode past him toward the shelter, the wind whipping her long, dark hair. Jake followed, his mind a whirlpool of adrenaline and awe. He had seen the power of the exile, the strength that had terrified her people. And he knew, with a sudden, absolute certainty, that he wanted her on his team. Inside the shelter, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot blood. Vex'ra sat by the fire, wiping her claws with a piece of salvaged cloth. She looked satisfied, her golden eyes reflecting the flames. Jake sat across from her, his body finally beginning to realize the toll of the encounter. "You're something else," he breathed. Vex'ra smirked, the sharp teeth gleaming. "I told you, Morrison." I'm a threat. He nodded slowly. I see why they were scared. You're a walking zero-day exploit. She looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction. And you? You stayed. You fought with a piece of junk. Jake shrugged. It was the only hardware I had. Vex'ra let out a quiet, melodic laugh. You're a very strange human, Jake Morrison. He leaned back against the wall, the warmth of the fire finally reaching his bones. Maybe. But I'm a human who's going to get you off this rock. She studied him for a long moment, the silence between them filled with the crackle of the flames. Why? She asked, her voice a whisper. Why risk your stack for an exile? Jake looked into the fire, his eyes reflecting the orange glow. Because no one should go offline alone in the dark. Not even a violet threat with horns. Vex'ra didn't respond, but she didn't turn away. The storm raged on outside, a white and endless fury, but inside the iron jar, something had changed. The exile and the astronaut sat in the warmth, two survivors in a cold universe, waiting for the reboot. Jake huffed, the sound a dry rattle in the humid room. I didn't know what I expected, but that was a performance of the grotesque. A ballet of the macabre. He watched her through the veil of smoke, his heart still a rhythmic drum in his ears. You enjoyed it. There was a light in your eyes that didn't come from the fire. It was the thrill of the kill, pure and unfiltered. Vex'ra tilted her elongated head, her horns tracing a slow arc in the dimness. I enjoyed the conclusion, she murmured, her voice a vibration of velvet. I enjoyed the sensation of being the victor in a world that wants me to be a deleted file. Is that the seed of your exile? Jake asked, leaning forward into the heat. That you were too much of a victor for their comfort? Vex'ra's smirk faded, her expression becoming a mask of stony, violet resignation. The light in her eyes dimmed, as if a firewall had been raised. She looked into the embers, her long fingers tracing patterns in the dust. My people have a profound distaste for the exceptional, she whispered. They prefer the gray, the muted, the predictable. They found my existence to be a loud noise in a quiet room. A bug in their perfect system. A threat from within, Jake mused. The most dangerous kind of malware. Vex'ra let out a laugh that was a series of dry, rhythmic clicks. Precisely. I was stronger, faster, and possessed a clarity of vision that made their leaders look like obsolete hardware. They didn't exile me because I was a criminal, they exiled me because I was an alternative. Jake shook his head, a sense of profound injustice boiling in his chest. So they cast you into the ice to freeze your ambition. To turn your power into a static image. That was the intent, Vex'ra said, her jaw tightening. They wanted me to be a forgotten ghost in a white world. A dataset that no one would ever access again. Jake hammered a fist against the metal wall, the sound a hollow boom. Idiots. They threw away their greatest asset because they were too small-minded to manage it. Vex'ra looked at him, a genuine flicker of surprise crossing her violet features. You think me an asset? Most would see a monster. A glitch in the matrix. Jake grinned, his cracked lips bleeding afresh. I see a woman who can delete a mountain of fur with her bare hands. If that's not an asset, the word has no meaning. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. They lost, Vex'ra. They lost the day they let you walk out of their world. She arched a brow, her yellow eyes glowing. You speak with a curious conviction, human. Jake met her gaze. Because when we get out of here, we're going to find them. And you're going to show them exactly what happens when a deleted file comes back with a vengeance. Vex'ra stared at him, her posture rigid. You still believe in the escape? After the creatures? After the storm? I believe in the hardware, Jake said, the word simple and absolute. Vex'ra let out a slow, shuddering breath, her fingers digging into the furs. She looked away, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Then, slowly, she turned back to him, a small, genuine smirk tugging at her lips. I suppose, she said, her voice a low vibration of silk. If I am to leave this cage, I could use a warm-blooded idiot to handle the logistics. Jake grinned, a real and vibrant thing. Now you're talking like a protagonist. Vex'ra chuckled, a sound of dry leaves dancing in a gale. All right, Jake Morrison. If you want to survive the ice, if you want to see the stars again, then you must become something more than a fragile human. You must learn to hunt. Jake met her sulphurous gaze without flinching. Upgrade me. I'm a fast learner. Vex'ra nodded, her horns casting a demonic shadow upon the wall. Deal. The fire roared, a small and defiant sun in the heart of the darkness. Outside, the storm raged, the predators prowled, and the ice waited. But inside the iron jar, there were two of them now. And they were no longer waiting to go offline.